Hello YouTube, Dave here again. So today I thought I'd do another Pathfinder playtest video, and today I want to talk about the Sorcerer class. So just for a little bit of a background, for me, the Sorcerer class was always sort of a point of contention for me. It was a class that I just never really liked that much. From its introduction in 3rd edition D&D, or at least when it became a standard playable class that's been part of, the D&D canon or the D&D standard classes pretty much ever since. And the reason for that is that so sorcerers always had the ability to cast their spells spontaneously. Now the trade-off for that was that they always had fewer spells that they knew. So that in of itself seems like a decent balance, but in 3rd edition D&D, which is where a lot of my sort of hang-ups on the sorcerer class come from, they not only had the ability to cast their spells spontaneously versus a wizard that had to prepare their spells ahead of time, including how many of each of the spells that they prepare for the day that they're able to cast. So like a sorcerer would have like 4 first level spell slots, let's just say. So they can cast any combination of their first level spells using those 4 slots. They could cast, mage armor and 3 magic missiles. They could cast a burning hands. They could cast color spray and a magic missile and a burning hand. Like they had that degree of sort of flexibility, and I always felt that made them a little bit too adaptable to the situation that they were in, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in my experiences, the groups that I played with, the wizard class became almost non-existent. Very few people actually ended up taking them, and one of the players that actually made a wizard at 1st level played him for about 3 levels of progression, and then when that character inevitably died, they wanted to make an arcane character, but they decided on the sorcerer because, to quote the player, the sorcerer was just the better class. So the issue was that the sorcerer also had more spell slots for each level. So the wizard, for example, would cap at like 4 for each of their spells. So a 20th level wizard still only has 4 first level spell slots, whereas the sorcerer capped at 6 for most of the spell levels that they had. I think like 8th and 9th may have been like 3 and 2 respectively, but they still had just more spells on top of not being locked into how many of each spell they can cast per day. So it was just one of those things that I sort of always had a problem with, and I'll be honest, when I picked up the playtest book here, I completely skipped over the sorcerer. I honestly just had no real interest in reading it. Because I guess I'm a bit of a traditionalist, and I just liked the wizard more, and I wanted to see a sorcerer class done in a way that doesn't just make them a more flexible wizard, fewer spells but more ability to adapt sort of to whatever they're going through, and knowing that they're never going to have to waste one of their spell slots because they prepared a spell that's just not going to work for the situation that the DM presents them. So, so the reason I've kind of actually started looking at the Sorcerer now is because I'm looking to run the 2nd chapter in the Pathfinder Doomsday Dawn playtest campaign book. I'll actually be doing that this Saturday, which is one of the last days before the survey for that playtest closes. So I really want to get it in before then. So one of the players just asked if I could make their character for them, and they gave me the character concept, and I built the character for them, and the character that they wanted to play is a sorceress. It's a female human sorceress that uses ice spells, and I'm not going to say too much about it other than, it's a human female sorceress that has like a noble background and likes to use ice spells, and again, the player's the one that suggested. I've never even seen the movie that the character came from, but I think I did an okay job. But as I went through, there was a lot of things that I kind of liked about the sorcerer, and one thing that I'm a little bit on the fence about, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So just a really quick look at the character sheet here. We've got just sort of your basics. So they're 4th level characters for the 2nd chapter, so it's right before they would get their next set of ability boosts. But we have an 18 charisma, 14 for dexterity and constitution. And so dexterity and constitution are really their next 2 most important attributes. I gave a 12 intelligence. I was kind of flip-flopping between 12 intelligence or wisdom, but I inevitably ended up settling on intelligence just because I finally wanted to have a character that actually had more skills than just the default ones presented by the class. And a 10 strength, because again, if a sorcerer is getting into melee and relying on their strength, then something's gone horribly awry, especially in this version of the Pathfinder game, where your cantrips are very similar to how they work in 5th edition D&D, in that they're at will, they're unlimited, and so you're never going to be without sort of something to do. So they have expert training in their will saving throws, and then reflex and fortitude are both trained. So they only get 1 good saving throw, whereas a lot of other classes usually get 2. So again, sort of a bit of a trade-off there again. Armor class 17, they're trained in unarmored defense, I guess you'd call it. Every character is assumed to be trained in unarmored defense. So if they don't have training in light, medium, or heavy armor or shields, if they're not wearing any armor at all, then they're still considered to be trained in that. Which is good, because they're not trained in any of those armors. So being trained, proficiency bonus is equal to your level. So we have 17 armor class for the character, and that's using the dexterity, the proficiency, and they get a small selection of magic items. So this character has a set of braces of armor that's equivalent to like the 1st level version of it, which gives you a 1 for your armor, sort of a 1 item bonus to your armor class in this case. So, and just the different skills that I have here. So interesting thing about the Sorcerer is, and I guess as spellcasters in general, not just the Sorcerer, but this was something that actually kind of confused me a bit when I first started making the character, is if you look on their spell sheet, and I'll just show this off a little bit here. So you've got what kind of spell casting they do, if it's prepared or spontaneous. So it's spontaneous, which spell list they draw from. This character draws from the arcane list, as well as their different like cantrips and spells that they know, as well as spell powers. And the thing that I kind of like about this sheet is they have a section. I don't know how it's going to show up here, but they have a section for the actions that the spell requires or that the spell uses. So, you've got most of the sorcerer spells are somatic and verbal. So basically most of these spells take 2 actions to cast, and you would know that by how many actions are actually filled in there. So it's a pretty quick and dirty way of knowing that this is going to take you 2 actions to do. The shield spell, however, is only a verbal. So, and the shield spell actually works similar to how shields work in the 2nd edition Pathfinder, which is something that I'll probably talk about in a separate video. Hoping that I'll get a chance to actually test it out in play and see how it actually works. But one of the things about the character sheet is that you have spell rolls, and then you have your spell DCs. Now, again, I'm used to like 5th edition D&D, where your spell attack and your spell DC would be presented right next to each other. So the spell roll is not for spell attacks, and it seemed weird to me to the point where I actually downloaded the pre-gen characters from the Paizo website for the playtest, and sure enough, you don't use the spell roll for attacks. I didn't come across any use for the spell roll in the spells that I have selected for the character. But my understanding is that there are some spells that you would make a spell roll for some sort of effect, whether it be determine the relative power of the spell, or if it's some sort of contested roll. I mean, I don't know exactly what the spell roll would be used for. I just know that it's not used for anything that I have here. And it is one thing that I will read up on a little bit more before I actually get to running the session. But the way that the spell works is if the spell requires an attack roll, you still have to make either a melee touch attack or a ranged attack that targets the touch AC. So you do that using your dexterity because the melee touch attack is considered to be have the finesse property. So inevitably what I ended up getting was a +6 bonus to the attack because I had the +2 for the dexterity. So that's why I say that dexterity is actually really important for the sorcerer class. And if I were to go back and do things again, because I actually didn't know that when I assigned the stats, if I were to go back and do it again, I would probably actually have just the 10 intelligence and work out a way to have a 16 dexterity, just to give, again, a little bit better of a bonus. Because when you compare the attack rolls to other classes, it can be quite a bit lower because you're not using your primary spellcasting stat, you're using another stat, which is just not going to be as high. The trade-off for that, of course, is that it targets the touch AC, but the touch AC isn't necessarily going to be all that different. With the first group of characters that I ran through the Lost Star, the Chapter 1, when they were first level characters, the biggest difference between touch armor class and the normal armor class was 2 points. And just about everybody else had 1 or none being the difference. And this character even has no difference between their touch armor class and their normal armor class. So it's one of those things that, I don't see why they couldn't use their spell roll when they're making spell attacks. It just, to me, makes more sense based on the terminology. Now, again, it may make perfect sense once I, get more into the spell casting system, because, again, I haven't actually seen it in play yet. But it's just sort of an odd thing about it, in my opinion. So I just thought I would sort of point that out if anyone is interested or hasn't made an arcane caster or spellcaster character yet. So with the sorcerer class, one of the things that I actually really like about the sorcerers in this version of the game is that they have bloodlines. Now, that's nothing new to sorcerers. Even Pathfinder First Edition sorcerers had their own kind of bloodlines that they had that gave them certain abilities or spells. But this one, the thing that I actually really like about it is that your your bloodline actually determines what kinds of spells you can cast. So in the Pathfinder Second Edition, or in the playtest, I should say, there are 4 different types of spell lists. There's the occult spell list, which is sort of a combination of arcane and divine. So like the bard is the player character class that draws from that automatically. And that's because they sort of always had that mix sort of thing. Then you have your arcane, divine, and then you have your primal list. So primal is what your druids and rangers would draw from. Divine is what clerics and paladins would draw from. And arcane is what wizards draw from by default. But sorcerers can, depending on their bloodline, have any one of those lists. So the first one that they give here is the aberrant one. So if you have Cthulhu monsters in your background, in your family tree, you draw from the occult list. So your bloodlines also give you what your signature skills are. So the sorcerer class itself only gives you the craft skill, and so signature skills are ones that you can train beyond the expert level. So other skills, if they're not your signature skills, then unless you take feats for them, then you can't go beyond the expert level. So that gives you what your signature skills are. They also give you free spells. So these ones you have, they're on your spell list, you can cast them, and they don't count towards the number of spells that you choose. With sorcerers, they add 1 spell for every spell slot that they gain. So whenever they go up in a level, if they gain a spell slot, they get to choose a spell of that level to add to their spell list. So for example, let's see what we got here. They have the actual example here. So at when you reach 2nd level, you select another 1st level spell because you go from 2 spell slots to 3. And then when you get to 3rd level, you select 2 second level spells, because you go from having no second level spell slots to having 2 of them all of a sudden. Your bloodline also adds an extra spell slot for each level, each spell level, and it wasn't overly clear when I was going through and reading it. It may have just been something that I just missed the line that it was in. But when I compared it to the pre-generated characters, again, they had an extra spell slot that they normally shouldn't have going off the chart. So it's because their bloodline gives them one as well. So you have that one which draws the apparent one draws from the occult list, and then you have angelic and demonic, which both draw from the divine, though they are themed very differently. Each class also, or each bloodline also gives you a power, a spell power. So I'll sort of get to that when I talk about the one that I chose for the sorcerers here that I made. You also have the draconic bloodline, which gives you access to the arcane list. The fey bloodline, so like elves or fey creatures, that gives you the primal list, and then the imperial bloodline also gives you the arcane list. So I had to choose an arcane character to make it work properly. So it was either between draconic or imperial, and imperial just made more sense for a female human noble. So they're basically like ancient mortals that mastered magical traditions. So their first power that they get, so you get your first one at 1st level, and you get, I think it's 4 spell points, and then you get your second power, I think it's at 6th level, and you gain a few more points after that. Your spell points, you use them, they're an action, and they give you whatever the benefit of the power is. So the initial power that I got for the Imperial Bloodline is called Ancestral Surge. So what that is it takes an action, but it basically increases. A second, I have it. I made up a sheet for the character. I did miss a line though, so I'll have to just write that in. Okay, yeah. So if you use it, it lasts until the start of your next turn, basically. But it gives you a +1 conditional bonus to your spell rolls and your spell DCs. And if you spent an extra point, you can increase it to last for another round. I think that's how that works. So your spell powers they're not necessarily spells themselves, but they can enhance your spells. They can sort of influence how some of your spells work. So again, it's sort of an interesting idea. It's an interesting concept, and I like that. So overall, so far, pretty much everything I've seen about the Sorcerer I really like. So with Sorcerers, they're more limited, and the way that they kind of do that in this version of the game is your spells work more like they do in 5th edition D&D than they did in the original Pathfinder. So there's a lot of sort of influences from 5th edition D&D that I found sort of in the playtest, but it still feels more or less like its own separate system. So in 5th edition D&D, if you have a 1st level spell, or a spell in general, I guess I should say, you can get, some of them will have more powerful effects if you use a higher level spell slot to cast them. So you can do that in the Pathfinder game, but it's called heightening the spell. So if you have prepared spells like a wizard or a cleric or druid or classes that have to choose at the beginning of their day which spells that they have, they can automatically just heighten one of their spells during that preparation. So if you had a cleric, for example, that wanted to have the heal spell as a 2nd level spell slot instead of just a 1st, then when they're preparing their spells for the day, they use one of their 2nd level spell slots, and boom, that's a heal spell that's been heightened to the 2nd level of power. With your spontaneous characters, because spells don't automatically scale like they used to, your spontaneous characters have to select higher level versions of the spells in order to get the heightened ability. So if you wanted to have a 3rd level variant of the Magic Missile spell, because Magic Missile has its 1st level ability, and then you can heighten it to either a 3rd, 5th, 7th, or I think 9th level spell slot. So if you wanted to have that third level version of it, you actually had to take that as one of your third level spells. So again, that actually sort of it's its own sort of balance, in my opinion, and I don't necessarily mind that. Like I was kind of on the fence about it when I first read through the book. But there's a few things in place that make that process a little bit easier. So I think it's at third level, the sorcerer gets the ability to spontaneously heighten. So during their daily preparations, they choose 2 spells, and those 2 spells, whichever ones they choose, they can heighten spontaneously. So they don't have to have the higher level version. They just so they could select, they just have like the first level version of Magic Missile, and they don't have the third level. If they chose that as one of their spells that they have the ability to heighten, and I'll show it on the sheet here. I haven't filled them in because I want to let the player make that decision on their own. And there's not too many spells that they can actually heighten, only having first, second level spell slots. But so you got like a spot where you can write them in. So if you only had the first level version of Magic Missile, but you chose that as one of your 2 spells, then you could burn a third level spell slot to get the third level effect of Magic Missile. So it's something in I kind of like the way that it works, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there might be some feats that increase the number that you can do. Can do that for. There might be class features. I'm not 100% on that because I haven't looked beyond the 4th level version of the Sorcerer. But it's sort of its own sort of minor workaround, and it's one of those things that at lower levels it's really great because you have fewer spells anyway, so you get a larger percentage basically of your overall spells. But at higher levels you end up having to really choose. But knowing that you can spontaneously heighten spells can also impact your decision on which spells that you take. So the one thing that I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to the Sorcerer is that whenever they gain a level, they can freely swap one of their existing spells for another one of the same level. And the fact that they can do that at every level means that, again, it's a lot more flexible, and it sort of negates some of that drawback, in my opinion. And I thought the way that they had it set up now worked really, really well. And I think the way to work around that, if I were to house rule it, I would say that whenever you gain a new level of spell, you can swap out one of your lower level spell slots for a spell of the same level. So not when you just gain a level. So if you go from having 2 spell slots of second level to gaining a third one, you don't get to swap out at that point. But when you gain a third level spell, your first set of third level spells, then maybe at that point you could retrain. Another option I would consider is that the only spells that you could drop without taking like a feat or doing like a retraining thing during your downtime, which would have maybe some sort of skill check involved, or at least some monetary cost or expense in order to do it, and have the time to do it, is when you take a heightened version of a spell, then you might have the option of dropping the lower level version of it and substituting it with a different spell, maybe. That's sort of the fix that I was thinking. It's just, to be able to swap out every single time they gain a level. Like, when you go from first to second level, I don't think you should be able to swap out one of your spells that soon, right? I don't like the way that works. Or even have it like every 5 levels. Like at levels 5, 10, 15, and 20. Let them swap out, or be even able to swap out, a number of spells equal to half their spellcasting modifier or something. There are ways to work around it, but I'm not a big fan of the fact that they can just swap out freely every time. Like, it's only 1 spell, so it is a bit of a restriction, but it's still every single time that they level. So they could, in theory, throughout their adventuring career, swap out spells 19 times. For a class that's supposed to be like innate abilities that manifest themselves spontaneously in the character, I think it's a little bit too much of a high level of customization is not the right word, but I don't think it quite fits the flavor. Now, if you got up to, say, being a master sorcerer, then yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, let the master sorcerer, you know, retrain or swap their spells because, you know, they've kind of reached that point. Or even a legendary one should absolutely be able to do it because they have that sort of system built into the game. But anyway, I just thought I would sort of share some of my thoughts on the Sorcerer class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Let me know in the comments below, what do you guys think of the Sorcerer class? I understand that I'm not the target audience for the class, and that I probably am holding on to a slightly unhealthy dislike of the Sorcerer, but there's a lot of things in this version that I actually think are really, really well done. And I'd be interested to see them sort of continue along those lines with the class. So anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time. Take care.